The de-risking strategy that an employer might take is primarily implemented by decreasing the equity exposure of the pension investments. That will lessen the volatility of the investments in the plan, the asset values, and that accordingly will lessen the volatility of contribution requirements in the future. But it doesn't necessarily lower them. In fact, many people think that it can, in some cases, increase the contribution requirements over the long term, because if they're changing from equity to fixed income, they may not generate as much investment income in the future. Certainly the opposite can be true also. If we have declining equity markets, you might actually have more investment income from the fixed income. So that can work either way. The final sponsor strategy we want to look at is requesting relief of some type. There's essentially two types of relief that could be requested. First of all, they can request hardship relief from the Internal Revenue Service. This is a waiver process. Probably everyone in the room here is very familiar with that process, but a lot of plan sponsors, frankly, aren't. It's not a terribly well-known process, and there's a few reasons for that. First of all, it's generally slow. It hasn't been used very much by most plan sponsors in the past, and there's a perception and apparent difficulty of being able to qualify. The Internal Revenue Service will grant a waiver of contribution requirements if they deem that there's a severe financial hardship and that it's temporary, so that the waiver will help the organization and that ultimately they will be able to make the contribution requirements. If the IRS looks at the situation and says this company is not going to be able to ever make these contributions, they're unlikely to waive that type of contribution requirement. The other thing that sponsors might do is seek legislative relief in some form to lessen their contribution requirements. So we'll look at that a little bit as we look at the regulator strategies. The first regulator strategy would be to reduce the minimum required contributions. Federal rules that determine the minimum required contribution could be modified. Immediate changes, for instance, could allow longer amortization periods of the current shortfalls. The amortization period is currently 7 years. That could be stretched 10 years, 12 years, pick your number for what you might like to be appropriate. But lengthening the amortization period would certainly lower contribution requirements. Another method that some people have suggested is making the funding requirements less sensitive to changes in interest rates and equity markets. So for instance, the change in interest rates has a big impact on the liabilities of the plan and subsequently the funding requirements. Making the requirements less sensitive to that change through longer smoothing periods or something like that may help sponsors, and some certainly argue for that type of change. Any of these changes would defer some of the funding, but not really change the funding target. The target would still be 100% of the liability of the plan. The ultimate requirement might actually be increased a little bit if less, as we talked about investment earnings, if there's less investment earnings generated by the fund because of smaller contributions, then eventually that's going to have to be made up in contributions. The final effect that we want to mention is that for participants, if anything is changed to lessen the funding requirements to the plan, that means less money going into the plan, funded ratio is lower, perhaps less security for the participants, less secure benefits for those. And the corollary to that is more exposure or risk for the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation. So we have these trade-offs on what happens when funding is lessened. Regulator strategy regarding de-risking. There's really two approaches here. The first approach is to encourage de-risking by linking the required contributions for the employers to some measure of risk. That measure of risk might be related to the sponsor's financial status or their credit rating. That's one way to do it. Another way might be linking the contribution requirement to the equity exposure in the pension fund or the degree of risk that the pension fund is taking. Finally, a third way that people have proposed is linking the contribution requirement to the maturity level of the plan. and the liabilities. A very mature plan has much more rapid cash flows. The money has to be paid out sooner and a little bit higher risk level because of that. So perhaps that could be a measure by which we link the contribution to that and encourage companies to de-risk a bit. The other approach is the status quo. There are many people that say public policy should not be used to influence the level of risk that sponsors undertake in these plans. That minimum contributions for two organizations that, say, have similar workforces, similar plans, they shouldn't have different contribution requirements merely because their credit risk is different. They point to all of their other benefits, their health care, their compensation programs, and say it's the same, pensions shouldn't be different. Equity investments. Many people believe that equity investments are good for pension plans because in the long run, they'll have greater returns. And these people do not think that we should have government policies discouraging that type of an investment in pensions. And then finally, there's some industries that might be particularly disadvantaged by this, particularly the mature industries with the large pension plans. Due to their maturity and other circumstances, they might be subject to more risk, and some people don't think it's appropriate to make their expenses higher in those situations. So there's various strategies that can be used, and our purpose here today is to encourage a discussion of all of these different ways that sponsors and regulators might deal with these issues. We think that probably a lot more research needs to be done in this, but we hope that what we're doing today is helping and enlightening more people on what the implications are. Regarding the area for future analysis, I'd like to ask Tom Terry, who oversees the Rapid Research Project, to talk a little bit about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Don. We're going to go to questions on exactly what Don and Joe have been talking about in just a second, but just to follow on to Don's last comment. While our goal today has been to reveal and to talk about and discuss with you the results of this first foundational study that we've done in the rapid retirement research area, we have another implicit goal, which is really to announce this capability to you and to the world. Basically, the profession, the actuarial profession now has a capability that we have not had before, and that is to use a robust model to collaborate with other professionals on inputs to the model, to come out with relevant and timely analysis and research associated with the U.S. private pension system. This slide simply identifies, in a very generic way, some of the kinds of things that we've got in our pipeline. And I chair a modeling oversight group that meets regularly to identify projects for that pipeline. Of course, as circumstances dictate, we may fast forward some projects going forward that seem particularly relevant because of some policy initiatives that are on the table at the time. But one thing we expect to be able to do is to track changes to the status of the system regularly on a timely basis over time. Certainly, we can do more investigation of the various effects of economic scenarios, not just a one-year hit to investment returns, but other sorts of financial and economic scenarios, different risk management techniques, the impact of those. We can investigate and will investigate, presumably, effects of any statutory or regulatory changes. And quite honestly, what we're most interested in doing is hearing from you and others as to what kinds of stresses and impacts on the system or opportunities for the system can and should be modeled with the kind of credible resource that we now have at our fingertips. So with that, what I'm going to do is turn over to Ethan, who's going to facilitate what I hope to be some more good dialogue about the study that we've just revealed that's been introduced by Joe and Don.
Thank you, Tom, Joe, Don. Very enlightening presentation and a lot of very interesting information.